let's talk Christian marriage books. In the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of pushback against marriage books claiming that they are causing abuse and not helping marriages, that they are enabling toxic, abusive marriages. When we're talking about abuse, we're talking about psychological abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, all the way up to physical abuse. There are over 18 different forms of abuse. It's estimated that 75% of Christian women are experiencing some type and some form of this abuse. And yet, 98% of Christian women buy Christian marriage books. Why? Because they're trying to relate to their husbands. They're trying to submit. They're trying to honor their husbands. They're trying to relate to them. The first thing that you do when relating to somebody else is work on changing yourself. Now, it's said that only 1% of men will buy a marriage book. So if 75% of women are experiencing abuse in their marriage, and yet 98% of women buy Christian marriage books, and on top of that, a lot of these women experiencing this now were raised with these principles. I myself, in the 90s, going through Bill Gothard and all the marriage books that my mom bought, understood that women were to submit. They were to honor their husbands. I didn't read the books, but I had that underlying idea. And so when I went into marriage, I actually believed submitting to my husband was going to make this great marriage. In fact, that's one of the things that Debbie Pearl talks about in her book, that she's writing it for the young ladies in 2006 who weren't married yet, so that when they got married, they would have great marriages. Now, in 2019, I was part of Leslie Vernick's Conquer course, and there was a lot of young ladies who came in having read Debbie Pearl's marriage book before they got married, who were living in marriages that were hell on earth. They were very toxic, very abusive, and they had no clue or understanding as to why. Sheila Gregory of the blog Bare Marriage, which used to be Love, Honor, and Vacuum, decided in 2019 to conduct a survey asking women why this is happening. The survey had over 130 questions. She picked 13 of the top best-selling marriage books off of Amazon, and over 22,000 women took this survey. To her surprise, the number one book that women said made their marriages the most toxic was the book Love and Respect. The second book was Shantae's book, For Women Only. The third book was His Needs, Her Needs. The fourth book was The Power of a Praying Wife. Now, I don't know what the rest of the books were because I'm not familiar with them, and I don't have them. Now, the book Created was not on the list because it wasn't a popular marriage book. It wasn't a bestseller on Amazon. It is not promoted by the mainstream Christianity. It is sold by word of mouth only. So let's talk Created. Created was actually my favorite marriage book. I actually bought several of them, handed out to friends. I probably handed out close to 30 of these books. Now, for the record, I am not a fan of marriage books. I do not promote them. I saw my mom buy every marriage book there was in the 90s through the 80s, 70s, Dr. Ed Wheat, Dr. Dobson, all of the Elizabeth Elliots. I don't know, you name it, she had it. There was a huge shelf, over 60 marriage books, and I never saw one of them work for her. None of them. In fact, even then, I was seeing the fallout of the Bill Gothard movement. By 2004, a lot of those families had left the movement. The families I knew had left the movement. Their children had rebelled, and it was just nasty. By 2011, I had a young lady over helping me clean house, and we started discussing the patriarchy movement and what's going on and the fallout happening there. And she raised her fist in the air and said, patriarchy doesn't work. Now, I couldn't argue with her. I was seeing the fallout myself. I was seeing how these books were causing not working in my marriage. I had friends that they weren't working in their marriages. I already had friends who were actually divorced. I saw abusive men become more abusive and marriages become worse. I saw controlling men become more controlling, lazy men become lazier. In fact, in a couple weeks, her parents were actually separated and they've never gotten back together. By 2019, I was seeing this fallout in a lot of my social media friends claiming toxic, abusive marriages. And it was shocking. By 2021, I had seen a lot of the forerunners of the biblical womanhood movement, the Titus II women. A lot of them had divorced by this time, claiming toxic, abusive marriages. One of which is actually Debbie Pearl's own daughter. In fact, several of the women that I have followed that were part of their church are now divorced themselves. Why? Why is this happening? Why are we seeing this fallout, even though these marriage books are claiming these perfect marriages? Now, No Greater Joy, in just about a month ago, Debbie Pearl is actually revising her book addressing this issue. Now, I don't know what she said, so I don't know, but this is what they put on their Facebook page. The last days have arrived. In our 60 years of ministry, we have never seen anything like it on this scale. It is shocking to see men so possessed with evil, so confused in their manhood, so lustful even toward children, so fundamentally soul-sick and filled with the devil. A plague has spread over the world that has engulfed the majority of men. Many righteous women married to a man who has fallen off the deep end into godlessness and depravity is in a most difficult place, maybe an impossible place. So, because they're getting a lot of letters now from women asking them, hey, I applied all this, I'm doing all this, and it's not working. Why? In fact, in just the last 3 months, the couple that actually introduced us to Mike and Debbie Pearl, they were married almost 38 years, are now divorced. Their marriage ended very toxic, very abusive. If a woman that I used to follow and get homeschool ideas from is now divorced herself. Her and her husband had 10 kids together. And then in the end of April, we have Micah Miller, who committed suicide. And those of us who understand emotional abuse understand that suicide wasn't because she had mental issues. It was because her husband drove her there. Leslie Vernick, in her book, The Emotional Destructive Marriage, talks about how emotional abuse actually destroys a woman mentally. And a lot of women commit suicide because of it. Spiritual abuse and sexual abuse are some of the worst abuses to actually live through and to live with. Now, in my pursuit of trying to figure out why these marriage books are actually destroying lives and they're not helping marriages and helping women have godly marriages and become godly women, I have pursued becoming a life coach. And right now I'm working through that reading list. And one of those books on the reading list is this book, Fight Right, by John and Julie Gottman. And one reason why I'm doing this is because 35% of women in these toxic, emotional, abusive marriages, and coupled with spiritual abuse, will commit suicide. That is huge. 35%. These women believe that they are serving God, they're doing what God wants them to do, but they are getting no love from their husbands. And they're being told that they aren't submitting, that they're controlling and they're manipulative. And, you're a daughter of Eve and you can't seem to live it down. And if your husband doesn't love you, how can God even love you. And not only are you destroying these women, but you're also destroying the children. And this was what God prophesied in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of good and evil. This is what he said to Satan. To Satan, God said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Not only is this a foretelling of the Messiah to come, but Satan didn't know which woman the Messiah was going to come from. So his job, and he has worked overtime to do one thing, and that is to destroy women. And when you destroy the woman, you destroy the children. So, as I was reading this book, there's several good principles in this book that take these Christian marriage books and actually blow them completely out of the water. Now, John Gottman has worked with relationships for over 50 years. He created what's called the Love Lab over in Seattle, where he has extensively done scientific research on relationships, how people get along. And some of this isn't just married couples. A lot of the research that he's done, they work with diplomats of other countries because diplomats have to learn how to get along with other countries and figure out so that they don't go to war. Conflict, how to deal with conflict, how to handle conflict. So, competing to win. In game theory, a zero-sum outcome is one where a win by one person represents an equal loss by the other. Poker is a good example of this. However many chips you lose is how many I gain. Some situations are truly zero-sum. There is no other way to play the game, but research has found that many people tend to interpret nuanced and complex situations as zero-sum even when they are not. They may be predisposed, for whatever reason, to perceive any scenario, even intimate partner relationships, as a win or lose gamut. In conflict, we are all especially vulnerable to this pattern of thought. Now, the Bible talks about this. People who are argumentative, people who are not being teachable, people who want to be right, and they will do anything to prove that they are right and you are wrong. It's a very competitive spirit. And when you have this with your wife and against your wife, that's a major issue. Now, obviously, they called these couples zero-sum couples. There's couples that would come in and they set them up on, they would have them discuss for 15 minutes their biggest issue of conflict, and then they would watch them and they would navigate, rate who won, who lost, who's winning, who's losing, all this stuff. And there was a lot of couples who were completely, one couple won, or one person won and the other person completely lost. There was no win. So they called these couples zero-sum couples in their interactions. There was always a winner and a loser. One person's gain was always the other person's loss. Of course, this mentality works great in poker, where the point is to win chips. But what we know about relationships is that if one person wins, the other person loses. What happens in the end is that both partners lose. We were interested to see what would happen to the zero-sum couples over time. But we had a problem. When we invited couples back to the lab through the years for follow-ups, a lot of the zero-sum couples weren't showing up. Well, we figured maybe the experience had been too stressful and unpleasant for them, and they were just opting out. But when we reached out to them to find out, we discovered that they hadn't dropped out. They had died. Specifically, the men. 58% of the husbands in the zero-sum couples had passed away over the 20-year time span of the study, compared with only 20% of the more collaborative couples. Obviously, this got our attention. We launched another study to see why this could be happening. What we found in couples where there was trust and cooperation, the blood of both spouses flowed slower. Their heart rate stayed lower and steadier, not only during conflict, but all the time. That's just good for overall health on a very basic level. In the zero-sum couples, spouses experienced a big spike in heart rate and stress hormone levels. That kind of psychological response to your partner takes its toll over time. Our conclusion? A zero-sum approach to conflict discussions was not only hurting their relationship, it was also hurting their health. Why only the men? Women, we believe, were more protected from the high stress effects of zero-sum conflict because women's bodies also produced oxytocin during moments of closeness and bonding, which can counteract the stress response. Now, men actually produce oxytocin too. It's actually a love hormone, not come from sex, but comes from bonding. Women experience it more in childbirth. It helps a woman to go into labor. But men have, through a study from Berkeley University in California, they found men have a harder time with oxytocin because of pride. So they have a harder time connecting because pride keeps this wall up. Humbleness is being vulnerable, and that wall is down so that there is connection then. The takeaway here is that the zero-sum dynamic in conflict is never going to serve you. Unfortunately, it's extremely common across the 40,000 couples entering therapy whom we assessed. 84% of heterosexual couples were struggling with a chronic inability to find compromise. Zero-sum thinking is a trap that any couple can fall into in the roller coaster of a conflict discussion. So how do we get there? How do we arrive at a place of cooperative gain in conflict rather than a toxic zero-sum dynamic? Lab data shows that the most successful couples and the ones who do best in conflict are those who can accept influence from each other. A counterintuitive finding from the Love Lab: if you want to win in partner conflict, you need to yield some ground. In the Love Lab, our studies found that in heterosexual marriages, the men who allowed their partners to influence them had happier marriages over time and were significantly less likely to divorce than those who resisted their wife's influence. In fact, men who refused to share power in decision-making with their spouses had an 81% probability of splitting up. That's high. The focus is on men here for a reason. Because of the way we're socialized and the messages we received about masculinity and femininity from the minute we're born, men do tend to struggle more with accepting influence than women do. Even today, men who are aware of this culture-gender dynamic and work to make their relationships egalitarian are vulnerable to this deeply embedded social conditioning that to be influenced and give up ground, especially to a woman, is to be weak. Even if we don't believe that on a conscious level, that culture messaging is coded in there somewhere, like a stealthy computer program running in the background. Now, as I read this, I thought about the theology that we teach in our Christian world of headship submit. It's winner, loser. The man is always the winner. The woman is always the loser, but she's not actually losing. She is giving her life over for her husband. But according to them, 81% of couples who live this way will divorce. They won't have happy marriages, and 58% of men will die. Now, I already said 35% of women who live in those marriages in the Christian world commit suicide. And I do actually have several friends who have terminal illnesses. What do? They serve their husbands. They've lived their whole life serving their husbands, and it's killing them physically, literally. Now, as I read through the comments on the No Greater Joy website under their heading of the end times have arrived, a lot of the comments said, oh, it's porn. Porn is destroying men. It's destroying marriages. This is why the men are becoming so evil. Now, if you've done any research through history, you will know men have always been very, very evil. This is nothing new that we are experiencing. In fact, during the Victorian era, when they wrote Pride and Prejudice, that was a horrible, horrible era. The 1800s for women. There is a reason why there was the suffrage movement. It was horrid for women. And it didn't make any difference if you were rich or poor. It was horrid. A man could have his wife put into the insane asylum for nothing. Just because he's done with her. Put her in the insane asylum. It happened to a lot of women. It was horrible, horrible, ugly. So what we're seeing here is nothing new. But, so I wouldn't say that is 100% because of porn. Now, Andrew Bauman, who works with men, and he deals with men specifically on porn, he wrote, the widespread of porn by men specifically has led to a baseline of objectifying towards women, a longing to conquer, possess, and devour beauty rather than to honor it. Now, as I read that, I thought, wait a minute. What happens when we teach young men that they're the head and women are deceived? They're basically stupid, and your job is to conquer, possess, and devour beauty. Not to work with beauty, not to protect beauty, and not to lift beauty up and be a partner with it, but to stifle it. The whole submission, headship submission thing that we're teaching actually is teaching men that women are nothing more than an object for their self-gratification.